Welcome, everyone, to another special edition of Catholic Family News. And I am joined today by Catholic author, intellectual, public speaker, and civil rights lawyer, Chris Ferrara.
Wow, intellectual. Oh, a new title. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Hey, you keep coming back. We'll keep giving you new titles. Well, we really appreciate Chris joining us today because, as our viewers know, he's very busy suing the most important blue states in the country. So far, as we talked about before, he's racked up New York, New Jersey, and California. And who, you liberal Democratic governors, you should be quaking in your boots because he may be coming after you.
Yeah, I'm sure they're losing sleep every night at the thought that little old me is going to sue them. California is in the offing right now. We finished the pleading and we're ready to launch that one. The other two are moving along nicely.
Great. That's great. Well, and obviously we've talked in the past about using the judicial system to advance and protect Catholic interests, as you've done for decades in your legal career. Today, I'd like to take a different angle and talk about the electoral system. And so how Catholics should approach the lever of government that it allows citizens to vote for various offices. And we'll focus primarily on the president, although there's a lot more at stake. The president in our system, there's a lot he can't do, and it really depends who controls the Congress and the Senate. But we'll say these big national elections, what is a Catholic to do? What's the approach to it? We at Catholic Family News and the folks at the Remnant have done a lot talking about this is an important election and recommended people vote for Donald Trump. But let's take this time maybe to drill down and answer some objections. So I'm going to do what I love doing with Chris. I'm going to play devil's advocate. So
I love a bench.
Yeah, I'm in the hot seat here, and try to raise some objections and see if Chris can deal with them. So first of all, as our readers know, you've written an excellent, lengthy book, "Liberty, the God That Fails," that really goes into the history of our country, shows how it's based on Enlightenment, liberal principles, that it was founded with liberal errors, and has had a lot of a troubled history with those liberal errors. So aren't we morally tainting ourselves if we exercise our right to vote and cast a vote? Aren't we giving our imprimatur of this whole liberal system? Are we burdened with all the errors of John Locke and the other villains du jour that you take down in your book?
Well, in certain circumstances, you might make an argument for abstention from the political process, as was seen in Italy after the so-called Risorgimento. There was a shadow government. People were abstaining because the process was basically totally foreclosed, and there was no hope of any kind of change in a positive direction. You could make an argument for abstention, but in this case, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with the most pivotal election in the history of the country, in terms of avoiding the deluge. The pro-life movement's at stake. The fate of children in the schools is at stake because they're about to be assaulted with all kinds of propaganda in the public school systems. There's never been a clearer choice, morally speaking, between the two candidates. Although conservatism in America runs the gamut from A to A, there really is no true conservative in the sense of a Pius X Catholic. Nevertheless, there is a relative choice, and the relative choice has never been clearer than it is in this election. For better or for worse, Donald Trump, as we said in our last episode, is the linchpin holding together a conservative coalition that's keeping us from sliding into the abyss. It's obvious what the Democrats have planned for us. They have planned for us a regime of total abortion on demand up to the moment of birth. Militant homosexualism would have no impediment whatsoever any longer. It would march through the public schools. And we would have a transformation of this country into a situation that makes even today's parlous condition of America look like a picnic by comparison. So we really have a duty to mitigate the damage to the common good by voting for not necessarily the lesser of two evils, but something approaching a Catholic conception of government. it isn't really a choice between the lesser of two evils. There are positive goods in Trump's agenda. I've benefited from some of them. For example, his appointment of conservatives to the federal bench. We've already seen a change in decision-making in the district courts and at the circuit court level by the replacement of ideologues on the left with judges who are thoughtful, conservative, exercise common sense and good judgment. That in itself is reason enough to vote for Trump. He's appointed over 300 judges to the federal bench, including circuit level appointments and 2 Supreme Court appointments. A good concrete example of this is a decision that just came out of Pennsylvania. A federal district judge has just struck down most of Governor Wolf's coronavirus pandemic restrictions as unconstitutional. 66-page opinion, full of common sense about how an emergency doesn't last forever. The governor has no right to impose a new normal. The distinction between essential and non-essential groups is arbitrary. If one group can meet for business, another can meet for purposes of divine worship. So that's one benefit. And the other benefit, of course, is the pro-life issue. So when it comes to the presidential election, we're not tainting ourselves. We're doing what Leo said we should do, making use of the existing political structures to bring about as much social change in the right direction as is possible within the system. Not only can we not abstain, we have a moral duty to vote.
So let me pick on a couple of things there. First, a detail that you mentioned that I'd like to emphasize. There's a lot of attention on Supreme Court nominations, rightly so, because it's the highest court, obviously. But you sort of point to something a lot of people don't focus on, that the changes are even broader than the Supreme Court. Because the Supreme Court hears, I don't know, what, couple dozen cases at most a year. Most litigation in this country is decided at the lower court level, the district and appellate courts.
That's right.
And you pointed out anecdotally, you're actually seeing changes, but on the sheer numbers, I mean, what has been the impact of Donald Trump's appointments to these lower courts?
Well, you see it in certain key decisions like the one I just mentioned. And there's going to be more and more of that indicated, especially in the Ninth Circuit, which is being remade, actually. It was overwhelmingly leftist ideologues on the Ninth Circuit bench and in the lower courts. But that's been changed substantially by Trump's appointments in the circuit. It's no longer the Ninth Circus, as lawyers like to call it. You have a significant number of conservatives on the bench now. And there's a couple of ways that helps us. It helps us, obviously, at the district court level. But if you're going up to the circuit courts, you could win a decision before a 3-judge panel before and have it overruled by an en banc panel. I had a case, it was a nightmare case, where we won a decision 3-0 in favor of pro-lifers in a First Amendment case. The en banc panel is seated. Based upon the party affiliations of the judges, it was obvious we could win a 6-5 ruling in our favor on the 11-judge panel. But then one judge recused himself, a Republican appointee. The Democrat took his place, and we lost 6-5. It was as predictable as just adding up the party affiliations of the judges. So now, if you win in the circuit district court level, and you go up and you get a panel decision in your favor in the Ninth Circuit, and then they call for an en banc review, and a majority of judges vote for en banc review, now you have a significantly better chance, even at the en banc level, of getting a 6-5 decision in favor of pro-life or whatever other issue is otherwise ideologically determined. So the impact on the judiciary is tremendous, especially in a system where judges are taking the role of legislators, and the conservatives, this is something how the Archies has long ago pointed out, conservatives retreat to judicial positivism. So, at least if we get enough of these judicial conservative positivists on the bench, they will say, let the people decide, not the judges.
Which, again, philosophically isn't ideal, but it's better than a liberal judge making the decision.
That's right. That's
exactly.
right. So at least they're confining judicial authority to its proper limits.
And, in a certain sense, this is what I've said, with the appointments to the lower courts in the long term may even be at least as, but even more significant than 2 or 3 Supreme Court justices. Because as you said, I like the term nutty ninth better than the Ninth Circus, I've heard. But, that really important circuit being transformed, as you said, another 4 years would be even more. But let me go back to the broader argument. So, as you point out in your book, one of the errors in our country's founding is this idea that authority comes from the people, and the people confer authority. So if I vote, aren't I just signing up for that error? Aren't I putting my name behind that mistaken idea by exercising my vote in a country that was founded on that idea?
Well, that's an interesting question, because if you look at the framework of the United States government as drawn up in the Constitution, putting aside the question of the First Amendment Establishment Clause, you're looking at a masterpiece of legal draftsmanship. Now, when the 55 men went into that room in Philadelphia and locked the doors and secretly devised this central government, numerous scholars have said they were conducting a coup d'etat. They were supposed to go into that room and tinker with the Articles of Confederation, which was basically a loose alliance of autonomous states, and provide perhaps for some common features, but nothing like what they actually devised in the room. Nevertheless, now that we have this government, centralized as it is in Washington, D.C., you look at it, it's actually a masterpiece of technical drafting. So if you're going to talk about where power comes from, well, power can be funneled through this framework just the way it can any other framework. So you take the position that when you're voting, you're acting as a delegate of divine authority. Because Leo teaches in his encyclical Diaturnum on the social contract theory that there is no social contract. There is a designation by the people, perhaps, of who exercises divine authority, but the authority descends from God to whoever the ruler is, whether the ruler is a hereditary monarch or someone chosen by the popular will in a democratic election. So the framework itself is not so much the problem. The problem is the conception by which the framework has been controlled from the beginning, which is that there's no authority higher than the people. And in particular, the majority of the people. But not the majority of the people, the majority of the electors, which is a minority of the people. And then, you're talking about 50% plus one of a minority constituency lording it over the majority. So the problem is what theory or what moral principles animate the voters when they go to the polls. So if your motives are correct, if you're saying as a voter, I'm going to vote for the result that most closely accords to the divine will and God's authority over men and nations, then the framework becomes irrelevant. If everyone in this country converted to Catholicism tomorrow, the framework would be irrelevant. We would be voting in elections according to the law of the gospel. There'd be no abortion, no sale of contraception, no pornography, no propaganda of an immoral sort in the public schools. We'd vote all these things out of existence. So the church doesn't really take a position on the preferability of monarchy over democracy. Leo makes that clear, although obviously we can make a serious argument, a traditionalist Catholic argument and also a prudential argument in favor of one ruler who's beholden to his subjects and must preserve his kingdom in order to pass it on intact, as opposed to mobocracy. We can certainly make that argument for the preferability of monarchy. But the framework as such is not the issue. The issue is, who are the voters? Are they animated by divine grace? Are they Catholics, or at least Protestants who are trying as best they can to follow God's precepts? And if they are, then they have a duty to use the existing framework to bring about any result in an election that could come closer to the result that God's law, that the law of the gospel would require. That's why we have to vote. We have a choice now that could not be clearer this year.
So again, good point there, that you're absolutely right. The church has, I think Leo says something to the effect in Diaturnum, the church can work with any of these forms of government, government of the one, the few, or the many, right? We can work with them. What matters, as you said, is what are the principles behind that form? What is that government trying to do? And you're absolutely right. I think even St. Thomas argues that there's a certain fittingness to a monarchy. So we might say it's if it works, it's the best form. But we also have to remember, he says, a monarchy, when it doesn't work, when it becomes a tyranny, is the worst form of government, because all the power is concentrated. And so that's actually why the church has never said, you're right, the monarchy, everybody must become a monarchy, because it has a lot of good to it, but there's inherent risk in it that you have to recognize. So I think that's a really good point. Also,
yeah, it's funny. I maybe interject something there. I mean, we have not lost the concept of monarchy. The president is an elective monarch with tremendous powers. I love to tell the story about how I was at a retirement community once where I was playing tennis and I was listening to the retirees talk about their various medical conditions, which is what they do. And I decided I'd bring up the subject of politics, so I told the story something like this. You know, we have this president who lives in a mansion, costs $1 billion a year to maintain him in the style to which presidents are accustomed. He flies around in $2 billion jet planes, takes multi-million-dollar vacations, commands the world's most powerful army, has the power of life and death by presidential commutation or pardon. And with a few simple commands, he can destroy the entire world by unleashing a nuclear war. And I paused and said, thank God we have no king, though. So the concept of monarchy persists. In fact, all of these things that the moderns decry persist in the existing system, including, of course, censorship of the wrong ideas. They're constantly censoring the wrong ideas in liberal democracies. So it isn't a question of democracy or monarchy as opposed to the correct conceptions operating within the framework that we've chosen. And St. Thomas also says, that in a nod to democracy, he says, it's good to have a king. I forget which section of the Summa this is. I think it's question 90 or 91. He says the people didn't have kings, they had judges. But then they demanded a king. And God said, oh, okay, you want a king? I'll give you a king. Now you'll suffer because the king will no longer be governed by the judges. So when St. Thomas speaks of kingship, he says kingship is fine when the people have a say in who the king will be so that everyone more or less participates in government. And so you don't have to be even a purebred monarchist, certainly not a hereditary monarchist, to defend monarchy while also recognizing the problems with monarchy. So this idea that traditionalists are all, seething monarchists who want to bring back the absolute monarchy of the past, the so-called absolute monarchies, is nonsense. All we care about is whether the framework of government that the people find themselves under, be it democracy, constitutional monarchy, or hereditary monarchy, is basically operating justly in accord with the proper principles. The first of which is authority comes from God. The highest authority is God's law, and Caesar must render unto God just as the people render unto Caesar. And if that's the case, we can have a decent society, which obviously we don't have at the moment.
We don't have, but I'd like to return to your point, because you said we actually have a duty, in a sense, to participate, because what would you say about someone who says, well, look, I'm just an average person, I'm just my Catholic, I'm just going to go to church, live my good life, and, this is beyond me, this is politics, why should I care? It's not really about me and my personal life. I can't affect anything.
Well, it is about you as an individual, because of the impact it will have on your life, but it's also about the common good. And the highest good in the framework of political society is the common good, and we participate in the common good as individuals. That's another error of political modernity, this idea that the common good is just the sum and substance of individual goods, the pursuit of happiness, whatever floats your boat. So the society that is the best society allows everyone to pursue whatever floats his boat, whether it's perversion or a normal heterosexual lifestyle or whatever you like. But no, there is a common good, and the common good consists of a society that is animated by the correct moral principles. And a society, by the way, if we're talking about the ideal, in which the mystical body of Christ, those who are baptized and in communion in one Lord, one faith, one baptism, is coextensive with the body politic. So you might say, well, I as an individual, this is beyond me, it's just politics. You still have a duty to the common good, even though it's not the ideal situation. And the common good requires that we avoid the election of a party that basically has an agenda from the pit of hell. There's no question about that. And if we don't do anything...
Or for the pit of hell emanating out of the gates in Beijing.
Yeah, out of the gates of Beijing. I mean, Kamala Harris, are you serious? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, she's a demon in human form. So...
Well, and I don't know if you saw Archbishop Vigano released another interview this week, and I thought the most incredible lines in it is he said, Joe Biden is as subservient to the wishes of the Beijing communists as is Jorge Bergoglio. I was like,
Well,
talk about a mic drop. It's like, wow. But it's true. Yeah, it's very true. So this is really, not like a choice between Bill Clinton or George Herbert Walker Bush. I mean, this is in sense a choice between the errors of Russia, right, to communism, and something that's certainly not communism. Because if there's anything Donald Trump is or isn't, he is certainly not a socialist.
No, absolutely not. And his appointments to the Supreme Court, his appointments to the federal bench,
Right.
his defunding of Planned Parenthood, his reinstitution of the Mexico City policy, and so forth, all the way down the line, indicate a significant difference, so significant that it's akin to what Pius XII confronted when the communists were running for election. It was 1945, I believe it was. And he ordered people, including nuns, to leave their convents and go vote under pain of mortal sin to avoid a debacle at the polls if the communists gained power in Italy. And if anyone doesn't think that the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would be a debacle, he's not paying attention to the real world. That what they have planned for us is, in fact, the end of whatever remains of the moral order of Christendom. They're saying it openly. And so we have a duty as individuals for our own good and for the common good to participate in the next election, despite the flaws in this political society we inhabit. There is no perfect political society on the face of the earth. So even in Hungary, where they instituted a Christian constitution, there are still serious problems with public and private morality in that country. And the paper document doesn't necessarily correspond to the public morality of the people. So we have a duty operating within this system to exercise our right. And if we fail to do that, I believe we've committed a grave error, perhaps even sinfully abstained from doing what we ought to have done for the common good. Now, you could make a different argument, by the way, in a non-swing state. So if you live in New Jersey, there's no way that New Jersey is ever going to vote Republican. So if you were to sit it out for some reason or other that you consider compelling, your vote isn't going to make a difference anyway in New Jersey, certainly not in California. I mean, forget it. You might as well stay home because California is now, 90% Democrat?
Although I guess the only qualification I put on that is for the presidential electoral votes, you're certainly right. But even within those states, you may be in a district where your vote for the congressman might make a difference. And again, for this election, in two details, I think the control of the House may be incredibly significant because whenever communists lose, whenever liberals throughout history and dictators have lost, they just reshuffle the deck and try another way. They call for a plebiscite, that doesn't work, well, let's have a different plebiscite. So a significant risk that I think is not being conspiratorial, but is reasonable, is that Donald Trump wins the election, wins the electoral votes, but they pull some tricks to try to disqualify electoral votes. And the absolute arbiter on the Constitution of who won the election is the House of Representatives. So there were no tricks played in 2016 because the Republicans, they were a weaker party at that point, but for what they were, at least controlled the House of Representatives and could shut that.
That's such an important point, actually. And if I would put it this way, if I had the choice between an overwhelmingly Republican Congress and Trump as president, if it were a binary choice, I'd have to pick the House of Representatives. That's overwhelmingly Republican, because that would be a roadblock to any legislation. The president would essentially be a lame duck for 4 years.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, the House election is so important that if you are in a district where you could swing it to a Republican being elected in place of a Democrat, I certainly agree. You have an obligation to go and vote for that candidate. And also, speaking of the Electoral College, let's give the founders their due. If not for the Electoral College, Hillary Clinton would be president.
Very true. Very true.
The Electoral College was an inspired legal provision because the framers of the Constitution recognized that if it were just a mass popular vote, if we had a mass democracy spanning the entire United States, then the most populous states would dominate forever. If not for the Electoral College, you might as well stay home from every presidential election because they would all be determined by New York and California. And Hillary Clinton is incessantly reminding us that she won the popular vote. But there is no popular vote for president. There's only the vote in each state for electors in the Electoral College, and she lost that vote resoundingly. So,
absolutely right, I think, on the intention to preserve the rights of people in Montana or Idaho or wherever to have a meaningful voice. But also, the other fallacious part about that argument is it's sort of trying to prove something by facts that are not on the ground. So, like you pointed out, there are many people who in California might have voted for Donald Trump thought, what's the point? Like, the electoral votes are decided, where if it were a popular vote, the actual results of the popular vote might have been very different because people would approach it differently. So we don't know. They propose we don't know who really would have won a popular vote if we had one against a pseudo-popular vote that has different incentives. So it's really a false argument.
Yeah, but I tell you what, I would never trust the fate of America to a nationwide popular vote.
No. Oh, no, for all the reasons you say, yes.
Yeah, and you need the states that are predominantly Republican or majority Republican. And again, this is why the Electoral College was a stroke of genius. Yes. It has saved us from disaster. I mean, it could work the other way, too. A Republican could theoretically win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. Yeah. But I'd rather take my chances with that arrangement than have a mass democracy of 150 million voters out of 330 million people. And that's a lot of votes, too many of which come from states that are blue states.
Yeah.
New York and California. If you subtract, by the way, we did a spreadsheet on this. I think if you subtract the California vote from the national tally in the 2016 election, she lost the popular vote by 650,000. Oh, and if you subtract New York and California, she lost it by over 1 million. Wow. Don't quote me on the figures, but it was something in that neighborhood based on a spreadsheet of the vote tallies from each state. So she basically, when she says, I won the popular vote, she means I won the vote in California.
In 2 states, right?
Yeah, yeah. Or even just California. Without California, yes. She wouldn't have won.
Yes. Well, so, and again, before we leave it, because you touched on a really important point, that Pope Pius XII, and that election in Italy after the Second World War, many people have compared to this election. Because it wasn't just, again, do we want this bureaucrat or that bureaucrat? Do you want this person or that person? It was really one of those moments in history. It was a deciding moment because the party that was running in Italy was going to turn Italy over to the communists, wanted to make it a communist country. And Pope Pius XII, as a true father, stood up and said, this is, what's at stake here is not just, are your taxes going to go up? Or, is this little regulation going to be a problem? This is a fundamental vote on the future of the common good of the country. And as you said, bound Catholics, not just under their normal general obligation to work for the common good, but bound them specifically for that election, that unless they have, reasons or in the hospital or something, some impediment, they were bound under pain of mortal sin. Now, the one comparison that is not true with this election is Pope Pius XII is not Pope. And instead of Pope Pius XII, we have a cheerleader for Joe Biden. So if you trust the judgment of Pope Francis on this matter, go ahead. But I've asked the question, if Pope Pius XII were alive today, would he maybe make the same requirement of Americans today? I think it's conceivable to argue.
Oh, I think so. There's no question of that. Yeah. Although, his close ties to the Italian state would indicate his involvement in that election. I'm not so sure he would be weighing in on the American election. But then again, if Pius XII were Pope, I'm sure he'd be issuing encyclicals and other statements left and right on the duty of voters to vote for the common good in terms of the pro-life issue and the other issues that confront us in the United States. Whereas Francis says, listen, this is indisputable. He's obviously an apologist and a lover of the Red Chinese regime. He says he loves the Chinese. His own advisors have been hobnobbing with the Chinese. Now we have well-supported rumors at this point, but apparently there's evidence to back them up, that China's been funneling hundreds of millions into the Vatican, which would explain some of the Vatican's positions vis-a-vis China, especially the sellout of the underground church in China. And Sarando, was it Sarando, his advisor, his chancellor of the Pontifical Council? Which Pontifical Council is it? It slips my mind. Pontifical Council for whatever it is. It's Archbishop Sarando, who has said that the Chinese best exemplify the social teaching of the church. Really?
Oh. The Chinese who practice the ideology condemned by Pius XI, socialism, which under Catholics can give no support.
And yeah, and preside over the mass murder of children and forced abortions.
Exactly.
They best exemplify the social teaching. Because in the mind of somebody like Sarando, the social teaching is basically socialism.
Yes.
Yeah, a regimented economy that redistributes wealth and supposedly benefits the poor at the expense of the rich. You know, rob the rich and give to the poor, which has never accomplished anything other than making the rich a little bit less rich, while the ultra rich are never affected.
Right.
Why do you think, by the way, so many of the international shakers and movers, the multi-billionaires, the world industrial complex, are always pushing socialist agenda items? They're pushing socialist agenda items because they're not affected by socialism. They ride above it. We're the ones that suffer with it.
They'll be the ones at the top controlling the collected means of production.
Another reason why this election is critical. Not only do you have the pro-life issue and the other moral issues, you have the issue of the globalist hegemon into which they want to insert the United States of America. You know, you see the video on the Remnant website with Jeffrey Sachs sitting next to Archbishop Sarando at the Vatican, giving a lecture on how everything is going swimmingly for the New World Order, except for the United States, which is now a problem. And the United States is now a problem because of Donald Trump.
Yes.
Whose re-election would be a very dangerous thing, says Jeffrey Sachs, the population controller, who thinks abortion is a good way to keep the population down, sitting next to Sarando at the Vatican, who's nodding approvingly while he says these things. Wow. So that's the other issue. We've got to avoid integration into the globalist hegemon from which Trump has had the audacity to withdraw us in several respects, the Paris Climate Accord, TPP, and so forth.
The World Health Organization, yes.
World Health Organization, which he's defunding. So yeah, that's the other issue. Do we want to wake up and find ourselves fully integrated at long last into the New World Order?
Yes.
This is why all the furies of hell are arrayed against Trump and his re-election. They know what's at stake, and so should we.
So let me as we're getting towards the end here, two more objections I'll throw out. So one is, okay, we'll agree. Donald Trump's done good. He's defunded Planned Parenthood. He's appointed some good judges, but he's not an integrally Catholic candidate. So, for example, even though he says he's pro-life, wants to protect human life, he's even said, I'll add as a footnote, which was controversial, he thinks people that have abortions in some states should go to jail. It should be a criminal punishment in some cases. But on the other hand, he said a few times that he'd be open to, as Ronald Reagan was, certain exceptions for maybe rape or incest, which clearly is an inconsistent position. He's, appointed, he's maybe done some things that show a little bit more tolerance towards or acceptance of the LGBT agenda here and there. They'll raise a few examples. So if his record isn't perfect, it's not perfectly integrally Catholic, it's not in lockstep, can we still vote for him? And I'll throw in the second kind of related objection. He's not a Catholic, and he's led a dubious moral life. He's, been married, divorced several times. How can we vote for someone that doesn't live a Catholic life?
Well, by that argument, we can't vote for anybody in American politics that ever rises to that level of the political framework. In national politics, who do we really have that's a devout, practicing Catholic? So what that really is an argument for total abstention from the political process. And we can't totally abstain from the political process with what's at stake. Just take the pro-life issue, okay? If he gets reelected, there's no question he's going to get at least one or two, possibly even three replacements to the United States Supreme Court. And if he does, Roe versus Wade is history. You've already got four that are ready to overturn it as just bad law that should never have been decided the way it was decided. So let's assume he gets reelected. We get, say, two more appointments. Roe versus Wade is overturned. The states can return to restricting abortion as they see fit, albeit according to the evil principle of majority will, but at least you'll get restrictions in numerous states. You'll get the heartbeat laws, no abortions after a heart starts beating, no sex selection abortions, no abortions based upon defects perceived or real in the developing fetus, as they call it. You get all kinds of restrictions and even an outright ban on abortion in some states. At least one or two would ban it outright. So how can you, if you decline to participate in the election and contribute to the election of Joe Biden instead, justify an outcome where all those lives would not be saved because you didn't cast your vote for the only candidate who would have changed the configuration of the court to permit the saving of lives through the state-by-state abrogation of abortion? You have that, just on that basis alone, you have a moral obligation. Sure, he's a flawed character, so is King David.
Yes.
So he's our King David. He's an adulterer by his own admission, or by his own conduct. I mean, it's adultery when you marry another after putting away your wife. But unlike King David, he's not a murderer, as far as we know. He hasn't killed anybody. So if King David could become a vessel of election, of divine election, and change the entire course of salvation history, in spite of being a murderer and an adulterer, who are we to turn up our noses at Donald Trump? Which of us is perfect? Which of us can say, I have not committed any of these sins in either deed or thought? Which of us has not gone to confession to confess serious sins of his own? We're all sinners. Donald Trump is a sinner. And so if the qualification for voting for a president is that he's not a sinner who lives a sinful life, we're out of luck in this country, because there are no choices. We only have relative choices. But the relative choice is exactly the one that is incumbent upon us, because we have a duty, as I said 20 minutes ago, to mitigate harm to the common good. And if we can mitigate it in any material way, we have a duty to do that by casting our vote. It's a moral obligation.
No, I think you're right. Otherwise, we'd be waiting for the next San Luis to be born to be able to have a president that we could vote for. And he may, a saintly ruler like San Luis may only come around every few hundred years or so. But Saint
Louis was a rarity even in
Western Christendom. Yes, he was.
Think of all the Catholic kings who were anything but saintly, and yet they were still governed by a framework in which they recognized, even if they were loath to do so, that they were not the highest authority. They had at least to pay tribute outwardly to the supremacy of the church when the two spheres interact in matters of public and private morality. So even the worst of kings in the worst of times when there was Christendom, when the church and state were more or less united in terms of cooperation, even though during those worst of times, we saw nothing approaching the excesses of political modernity. We certainly didn't see 50 million abortions in a country. We never saw world wars. Wars were local affairs. We never saw the spread of depravity of the sort that led Pius XII to say in 1950 or 51, the state of the world now is worse than it was before the flood. So again, it's not the framework, it's whether the people correspond to the movement of divine grace, that is, whether they are baptized and unified in the mystical body of Christ. If that happens, if America becomes Catholic, then every election will be a choice devoid of these problems of prudential judgment. We'll just have Catholics running for office, as in Garcia Moreno's Ecuador. And because he restored Ecuador to the status of a Catholic Commonwealth, he had to be assassinated. Remember, he predicted his own assassination.
Yes.
He'd actually pulled off the amazing feat of reconstituting Ecuador as a Catholic country. Only Catholics could hold political office, and he brought about a tremendous spiritual, economic, and social revival in that country. He wrote to Pius IX and said, the order has already gone out from the Masonic lodges in Germany that I am to be assassinated. And he was assassinated. He predicted his own death. Pius IX erected a statue to him in Rome, calling him a custodian of the faith as a political leader. Well, and we don't have a Garcia, you don't have Garcia Moreno here in our time, but we have choices that are clear enough that they're morally incumbent on us.
Well, and again, follow up on that maybe to close. Obviously, no one is saying Donald Trump has read Quas Primas and is trying to establish the social reign of Christ the King, but maybe he will. So, I mean, the guy does seem open to things. Maybe if somebody sends him Quas Primas, he might tweet it out. Who knows? But
well, don't forget, he tweeted Vigano's letter.
Exactly. But in any event, even if that's true, what he has done, I think we have to recognize, is actually brought God back into the public square. it's something we've forgotten, right? 50 or 60 or 100 years ago, presidents who were not even Catholics spoke about God as the Christian, Christian understanding of God, our Lord Jesus Christ. And, I would think, I hope you'd agree with me, our country, certainly our end goal is the social reign of Christ the King, consecrate our country to him. But we're certainly better off on the natural level having a leader who acknowledges the existence of Lent, writes a letter saying this is, I encourage you in your prayer and fasting, who refers to God, who refers to our Lord, and again makes clear he has a deep respect for the Christian religion and is willing to be critical of others. Right? We're much better off with that than a essentially atheist socialist who wants God completely removed from any reference in public life.
Well, how about his Christmas speech?
Yes.
The Christmas speech in which he specifically mentions Christ, refers to him as our Savior, and refers to, I'll quote it for you. Christians give thanks that the Son of God came into the world to save humanity. Okay? In 250 years of American history since the founding of the Republic, not one president has said anything of the sort, which I find remarkable, that this thrice divorced or twice divorced former playboy would say that. Jesus Christ inspires us to love one another with hearts full of generosity and grace. So for him to say that the Son of God came into the world to save humanity from the White House on Christmas Day indicates that something's going on with Donald Trump. I don't know whether he's undergoing a personal conversion, but the fact that he's even willing to say these things, coming from the mouth of our King David, is an indication that something is going on in American politics that just may be a providential development. And all of it points to the conclusion we've been arguing from the beginning of this show, that there's now incumbent upon us a moral duty to vote in the next election to avoid what will otherwise be an absolute debacle. We have to get to the polls and vote in local and national elections for our own good and for the common good.
Well, you shot them all down, as you always do. No more objections.
Well, you shot the clay pigeon right up in the air. All I had to do was fire at it.
We all have our roles to play. Well, thank you, Chris, for joining us. And hopefully we've helped some people viewing or listening to this in our podcast form to kind of think through these issues. And we certainly are happy to have, I think, the preeminent expert in America on the American constitutional system and American history. If you haven't yet read it, Liberty, the God That Fails, is the essential book to understand America, understand where we are, and understand this need to just, again, that's the whole reason for it. I think why Chris would say he wrote the book. You can't fix the problem until you diagnose it. So the idea isn't to diagnose the problems in our country to say, wow, isn't that a shame? It's so bad. It's to say, okay, what do we do about it and fix it?
Yes, and I would point people to the final chapters of the book, which say, look, we have to make use of the existing democratic framework to bring about change. And I give examples of how in Hungary and Latin American countries, including Nicaragua, there has been such change within the democratic framework. So if you have any doubts about this, whether you should be participating in the process, remember what Leo XIII said. We have these liberties. He called them cankered liberties. He said, yes, they're cankered because they're based upon wrong conceptions of what man is and what his destiny is. But we have to make use of these cankered liberties without violating our consciences to bring back all of society to the form and pattern of Christianity. So we have to work within the existing framework. It's all we can do. And it's what we have to do in the next election.
Excellent. So again, go vote. And when you're out, stop at the book, order on Amazon, Liberty, the God That Failed. So thank you all. Still available. They haven't censored them yet. So buy it before it gets censored.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And if you enjoyed this content, please share, like the video, like the podcast, share it with your friends, share it with your enemies. Maybe you'll wake them up. Share with everyone you know. And if you enjoy the content that we make free at Catholic Family News, please consider subscribing to the newspaper by looking at our website, www.catholicfamilynews.com, where you can sign up for an e-subscription right now. And very soon, since our office is opened in Buffalo now, we hope to be able to be selling print subscriptions again soon. So thank you for your support, and we'll welcome Chris back sometime in the future to talk about another topic. Thanks, Chris.
God bless, Brian. Take care.
Ite missales, alleluia.